details before we start. Those of you who are listening from home, if you have a question, if you would use the Q&A function on your screen, and if you have any kind of technical problem, please get in touch with Alex, who's our wonderful tech person here, and he will help you with that. And without further ado, I'm going to introduce John Crippen. John, thank you.
Thanks, Jackie. And thank you all for being here. Thanks for inviting me here. Hennepin History Museum has had a growing partnership with Plymouth Church. So I'm just really excited that we can take it to the next stage today. Pre-pandemic, which seems a lifetime ago, we had a wonderful program here with Bill Green, because we were, with Bill's star power, we were way outgrowing our building. And so you opened up your facility to make that possible. And as I'll talk about in my slideshow, we had a program that we were planning pre-pandemic, and then we finally pulled it off last year. So it's great to be here. It's great to connect with you in a new way. And Alex, I probably am slow in sharing my screen, right? Let me continue. Here we go. Here we go. Okay. Is that pulling up all right? Do we want to get rid of yeah, there we go. So in case you haven't noticed, Jackie figured out we are your near neighbors. And I'm finding new connections all the time. John Davenport's here in the audience, and John is one of our most faithful volunteers, coming in every week, working in our archives. So the connections just keep popping. It's fun to see. So I'm just going to do some quick overview of some of the programs we've done and some of the programs that we've got in the works, and hopefully leave a lot of time for questions and discussion afterwards. So I'll just launch right in. I've kind of gotten obsessed with quotes in the last couple of years and just collecting them when they arise. And Hy Berman was an old professor of mine at the U of M, and a book came out a couple of years ago of his. He had worked and talked with a local author, and this quote just really popped out at me and Hy Berman was a great fan and a great supporter of local history. And I just love his thought that this is why we need community history. This is why we need local history, because otherwise we're a community with amnesia. And somebody with amnesia, as he says, you can function, but you lose your sense of purpose. You don't know why you're doing function. So I think this really grounds what we're trying to do. We're trying to make sure our community doesn't have that collective amnesia. And we're also, as we're developing new programs and as we're putting our plans in place, we're keeping in mind a quote from Kelly Hernandez, who was a MacArthur Fellow a couple of years ago. And this just epitomizes what we're trying to do as well. We study the past to understand the present and then reimagine our futures. Increasingly, that's what we're finding is this is what people want and need history for right now, is to help them understand how we got where we are so that they can start planning future things in a better way. This is, it's the height of relevance. It's why we can say that we're going to matter for folks. So that's kind of just the grounding of what we do and how we try to do it. As Jackie suggested, the beginning of our journey along these routes was an exhibit actually back in 2018 and into 19 called Owning Up, Racism and Housing in Minneapolis. And I'm glad to say I don't really need to say too much more about this topic, because it feels to me like this has become well known now in local circles. I'll do a quick highlight for any of you who have possibly missed the story, just to give you some grounding. But this was our first foray with the Public History and Heritage Studies program at the U of M. So this was a student-developed exhibit, and it was building off of the work of Mapping Prejudice, which has been doing this amazing research to document the redlining that segregated our communities through the 20th century. But this really woke up the Hennepin History Museum as well, because we've started to realize how much this resonates with people, how much this gets people excited about history. It's far and away our most popular program in the last 5 or so years. And so we paid attention and said, all right, what more can we do? So again, with apologies for those of you who have already immersed yourself in this subject, I'm just going to give you a brief outline to reacquaint, if you will. This is a map from the 1930s that shows the redlining, and what the redlining is shorthand for what urban planners were doing in the early 20th century to give people an idea of where they should go or where they had to go in terms of buying housing. And they mapped this out, and then realtors saw this, and homeowners and home buyers saw this. And hopefully you can see it okay in the lower right. You can see the different colors, and it's called redlining because in pretty offensive ways, all of those red districts, they say are hazardous. So can you imagine wanting to buy a house in a hazardous part of town? And these were all, and so what they did through lending practices, through federal policy, et cetera, they took minority potential home buyers and shoved them towards the hazardous areas. And they took the wealthier white people and shoved them towards the, hopefully, if you can afford it, the best areas or the still desirable areas. But if you must, you can be in the definitely declining. So it's just an awful thing, and it created the neighborhoods that we have. This was then reinforced through covenants, and I'm guessing that many of you heard about this as well. There's a project going around town right now called Just Deeds, where people are going into the deeds of their property and finding out if there was a racial covenant. So there was federal policy that created these districts and areas, but then people baked it into the deeds of their homes and said, if you buy this home, you agree that you will not sell it to people of color in various unpleasant descriptions. And what you can see from these two maps from the Mapping Prejudice website, in 1911, there were 4 racial covenants. A year before, there were 0. And then by 1955, there were over 22,000, where individual properties were designated that if you buy this property from me, you agree you will not sell it to the wrong kind of people, as they termed it. So this, again, just tilted the balance and created disparities throughout the community and throughout the area that we're still struggling with today. One of the things we like to do with local history is tie it to broader trends as well. And we should all hold ourselves accountable and say, what do we do about this in Minneapolis, in Hennepin County? But we should understand too, it wasn't just us. And one of the great programs we did in partnership with Plymouth Congregation was bring in Richard Rothstein, who did a book called The Color of Law, where he studied this nationally. And again, this was federal policy in city across the country. And so this is not a unique Minneapolis story. We just have to own, as the exhibit implies, we have to own up our part of this story and figure out what we want to do about it. But this was a great opportunity. Catherine Shreves was a huge leader in putting this project together with us. Helped us get the funding from POLED and Minneapolis Foundations. And it was just great to have several hundred people learning more about this story. So the journey continues, and we kept working with the public history program at the U, and we're brainstorming student ideas with those folks as well, and came up with Human Toll. And I think this is the exhibit that Jackie saw recently. And we've now realized there's a trio of exhibits that all tie together. So Owning Up talked about the redlining and the covenants and that sort of thing. Human Toll takes the story to the next level. And what you see in the background here, behind the scar of the being newly constructed 35W, are the lines of the highways. I think you can recognize 35W going north-south, 94 going east-west. And not coincidentally, because again, public policy, those lettered areas were some of the highest concentrations of African-American residents in the Twin Cities. And so the Rondo neighborhood is that box G over to the right. That's the most famous one for a lot of reasons. I think they got to this story early. I think it also plowed through the Rondo neighborhood in a particularly violent way. Box A is South Minneapolis, as you probably can tell, and you can see it skirts a little bit more to the left in Minneapolis. And so I think that's partly why it was a little less well known what was going on in Minneapolis, because it didn't. 4th Avenue South is the traditional commercial corridor in the South Side, as Blacks in the early 20th century referred to it. And 35W is just to the west of that. It didn't plow right down the middle. It, in effect, 35W cemented literally the red line. And it said, all right, we're just going to create this barrier so that that hazardous red area to the right stays to the right and doesn't bleed over into the Lakes District. And then, of course, as you can see in B and C, it plowed through a lot of stuff as well. So one of the things that Human Toll talks about is there was some equal impact at the start with a construction like 35W, in that there were a lot of white homes that were lost as well. But there's a disparate impact when you get to the end of this process because of those covenants, because of the redlining. If you were a white family and your home was being removed from 35W, it was relatively easy for you to take your money and go buy another house wherever you wanted to buy it. But if your prospects for buying a home were limited to these areas around town, it was just a lot harder. And so it really destroyed the fabric of the community in all sorts of ways. So that's going on now. And we're just excited to be able to tell that story. And again, this was a partnership, a student-built exhibit, which is always kind of fun as well. And then coming soon this spring, opening on April 28th, is Separate Not Equal. So if you segregate communities and the school system is based on community schools, you're going to have segregated schools, right? And so 1954 was Brown versus Board of Education. And everybody assumes these days, well, that was a thing in the South, right? But there was segregated schools all over the place, including in Minneapolis. And by the 60s, people were starting to say, wait a minute, I thought we tried to fix this in the 50s and we're still segregated. What's the problem? So we're focusing on, it's the 50th anniversary of the Hale-Field pairing. And so we're doing an exhibit this spring that talks about Minneapolis's first effort to do some busing, do some desegregation of the school system. And it was a rocky road and not smooth sailing, but a lot of heartwarming stories as well about people today who still remember being grade school kids at that time and remember being part of that experiment and the lessons that they learned that they still hold today. Jackie and I were talking at the beginning about an online program we had a few weeks ago, and it was just this great, it was like a school reunion of grade schoolers. It was people who said, oh, they hadn't seen that teacher in 40 years, and they were just having a great time reconnecting. So this is going to be a fun exhibit to, I think, bring the community together in some interesting ways. As you can see on the lower left, these things don't often go smoothly. Change happens slowly. So parents in the Field school worked hard, and Hale School as well. There was a lot more opposition on the Hale because that was 90+% white and the Field school was 55% black. But the parents were figuring out how to make Hale-Field work, but the Minneapolis school system was dealing with all of its pressures and what have yous. And so there ended up being a lawsuit to try to spurn this on. And that's what that reference is the Booker versus Special School District, where the court system said, Minneapolis, you need to get with the program. This is established law, but you're not meeting your requirements for a desegregated school system. And so similar to what we've heard about in the South with elections being monitored for decades because of the Fair Vote, the Voting Act, until the mid-'80s, Minneapolis was under court review to monitor their progress on this desegregation effort. So it's part of that historical process to try to move things in a new direction. So I just throw out a couple quotes. These will be in the Separate Not Equal exhibit, and these are long. The first one is a little disturbing, to say the least. But this was the feeling that a lot of people had, and I'm afraid probably still have, where they were saying, we just want to be with our own people. And whether it's on an economic, education, nationality, ethnic, or other level, forcing people of unlike moral and economic backgrounds will only spell trouble. This is the kind of argument that was happening in 1971 in Minneapolis. But Richard Green, who was a superintendent of schools in that era, eloquently talked about why they worked so hard to do this desegregation. And I think, as all of you know, once you get to know people, you break down the fears, the stereotypes, the myth, and you realize these are just people. Let's figure this out, folks. One of the things that I've been reflecting on is why does Hennepin History Museum do this work? Why is it important? And another one of our programs this winter was called Life on the South Side. And Louis Moore and Nelda Huggins were two of the speakers at that. And I was struck by something Nelda said at the end of that program. She said, "This has been healing for me to talk about the life that we had, the neighborhood that we had in the 1940s and 50s. And we had a follow-up conversation down at Turtle Bread, and she was talking about the stages of grief and how she went through the anger phase. She went, after college, she went off to California while 35W was being built. She came back and just could not believe her eyes at what had happened to her community. And so she was going through the stages of grief. And what she was reflecting on now, later in life, is she's coming to acceptance, and having conversations about this history helps with that acceptance, helps with processing the grief of what was lost. So to me, that's really cool and powerful. It's like this makes it feel like we're not just doing history for the sake of history, we're helping people. And also, we're not a public policy organization. So how do we help public policy? How do we be part of the solution, if you will? It's not our job to say, here's how we fix segregation, here's how we fix housing policy. But we tell these stories, we document these stories, and as Louis Moore says, people need to feel about an issue, and we help them reconnect with their feelings about how communities were built and how communities were damaged. And hopefully then empathy will help change public policy. So we're hoping to be part of that conversation in all the work that we do. So changing gears a little bit, this is the other big initiative that we've got starting this spring and will go for the next few years. We've got a number of things coming together that are getting us down a road towards an interesting approach to family history, I think. So I say interesting, and we're trying to push the envelope and say, with the name, we're calling the initiative Radical Roots, New Approaches to Family History. And we're boldly saying this is radical for a few reasons. One, we're trying to give people new ways to think about collecting their family history and sharing it. So up at the top, Family in Pieces is an exhibit that'll be opening in May, where a woman who can trace her family back to the lumber milling on the St. Anthony Falls in the mid-19th century has come to the grips with the legacy of her family a little bit, but also she's one of those family historians that's collected all the stuff. And now what do I do with all the stuff without being overburdened? And how do I share stories with my family? And she's an artist, and she's created these collages of her family history. And we're showcasing her art to give people an idea of a new way that they can think about their family and sharing their stories. So one example is her great-grandmother was a writer. She's got her grandmother's writing desk, she's got letters, and she's got photos from the family. And she's put these all in a beautiful art piece that tells the story of her great-grandmother. So we're excited to share that with folks. And then we're excited to do programs and workshops keying off of things like Family in Pieces and keying off of things like the Memory Lab. So right outside of the library where John does his work every week, we're installing equipment to allow people to bring their family artifacts in, and they don't need to donate it to the museum. They don't need to, they can do it for their own purposes. But if you have a VHS tape of an old family event or something and you can't watch it anymore because who's got a VHS player this day and age? We've got the equipment now that we can convert that to digital. And so now with the click of a couple buttons, you can share that with family members across the country. If you've got this cool snippet of something from your family's story. And then we'll be doing magazine articles as well. We've already started that a little bit and we'll continue to lean into that. So we're hoping to, as I say, give people new ideas and new ways to think about their family history. And part of the Radical Roots is recognizing families are changing these days. So lots of people have complicated relationships with their blood families, but they've built other families. And so we want to create some openings in these workshops as well to say, however you're defining your family, let's help you define that and document that history a little bit. So we're excited to tell you more about that in the coming weeks. Another different path altogether is we've been having a lot of fun in the last year or so, kind of delving into art and how art can help people understand and appreciate history. And in this case, how art can document history. So I just wanted to tell you quickly the story of Sean Garrison, who's a local artist. You see the back of him here. Some of you might have seen this news on TV. Sean decided when the trial for Derek Chauvin was coming to a close, he decided he needed to be on the mall of the government center and document that moment, the feelings of that moment through his art. And so what you see in that upper left image is a piece that he ultimately called Walking on Air. And he tells a great story about the evolution of this piece. He's literally documenting a moment in history. And he set up the easel and he had set up his paints, and he started with black and angry red tones because he didn't think this day was going to end well. But as the verdict was announced and the plaza erupted with the joy that we all saw, he changed the color palette and started with these bright oranges and blues and what have you, and ended up calling the piece Walking on Air. So it's just a really inspirational and cool story of how a piece was made real time. So then he was getting a lot of attention for that and a lot of excitement, and he decided he wanted to take it to a new level and do a live painting event. And one of our board members was acquainted with Sean, and that's how we got hooked up together. So we worked together to sponsor and promote this event down at the Kohl's Center. And what you see on that bottom frame are 8 canvases that are 5 by 8. So this is a huge piece. And he worked with kids down in Powderhorn to create a 60-minute soundtrack of the last 2 years of living in Minneapolis. And so as the soundtrack was playing, he was filling these canvases with his emotions through abstract art. And so it was a profound experience. It was, you're hearing George Floyd's last words, you're hearing sirens, you're hearing things that you maybe didn't want to hear again for a while. But you're also hearing some of the joyful aspects of the last 2 years as well. So the image on the right is the one of the 8, number 5 there, you can see if you're trying to track, that he donated to the museum. So that's now in our permanent collection. And then a local law firm, Best and Flanagan, gave us financial support for this. So they've got one of the 8. This is a little plug for Sean. The other 6 are still for sale. So if you're interested in a piece of history here, he'd be happy to talk to you. So this will be up round about the time that Separate Not Equal opens. We're going to get our piece of this work in the great room with a 10-minute version of that 60-minute painting experience, so people can get a glimpse of what it was like to watch him process these emotions in a really powerful way. Also, when Sean's piece goes up, we are getting from TPT, and it's currently on show at St. Catherine's, a little bit of a taste back to a exhibit that we had in the middle of the pandemic that nobody really got to see. Quietly happening in the early days of the pandemic was the 100th anniversary of women's suffrage. And Leslie Barlow, a local artist, has created a number of portraits of important women in Minnesota that were part of that effort. The woman on the left is Marie Bottineau Baldwin. The woman on the right is Clara Euland. And so we're going to have these faces in that room as well. So the museum's really going to come alive this spring in all sorts of fun ways, I think. Summer's coming. So one little last tease out to all of you. We do walking tours, and people really enjoy taking walking tours in the summer. You take advantage of the warmth when you get it, right? As we were thinking about this journey we're on, to not abandon all the old history that we've traditionally done, but to think about it in new ways and to make sure that we're making it relevant to people. We looked at the Washburn Fair Oaks walking tour, which is, again, just a few blocks away from all of you. And a longtime volunteer had developed this top-notch research and tour of the Washburn Fair Oaks Historic District. And it focuses, as you would expect, a traditional walking tour on all of the big mansions that were built by all of the big flour millers from Minneapolis's heyday as the flour milling capital of the world. And she moved on to other things, as volunteers do. And so the tour had kind of lied fallow for a few years. And we started to think about what we could do to reboot this tour. And one of our staff members, he's the fellow in the blue Oxford in the back there, lives in the neighborhood. And he said, you know, the story of these mansions in the last 50 years is equally interesting, because when the big families moved out of these buildings and moved to Lake Minnetonka primarily, social service agencies, nonprofits came in and bought these homes in many cases and have now created a new kind of vibe in Whittier. So we spend half the time getting people grounded in the important stories of why are these big homes here, and why are they next to the Art Institute? This is no accident. This is all interesting and important history, but what's happened since in the last 50, 60 years, and how has the neighborhood changed, and how has that change been managed by the neighborhood, by the city, and what have you. So I think it's a fascinating approach to the history of the neighborhood, and I would encourage you all to sign up. Or, since we've got a special relationship, if you guys want to pull together a group of Plymouth people, we can give you a special Washburn Fair Oaks tour if that's in your idea of how you guys like to spend time with each other. So I promised I'd leave time for questions, answers, discussion. Please visit us when you get a chance. As you can tell, you might want to wait 6 weeks because there's more coming soon. But we've got a lot going this spring, and we're really excited to share it with people. So with that, I'd let people say what they're interested in. It's at 2303 3rd Avenue South, sorry. It's half a block down the street from Mia. So it's, if you're on the old traditional entrance of Mia facing downtown, we're off to the right. Oh, now I'm seeing myself doing weird things.
Well, most interesting. What are the funding sources of the institution?
Sure. About 40% of our annual budget is from Hennepin County. We were originally the Hennepin County Historical Society, and in 1991, they decided to get rid of that name and try to be a little bit more modern. So we're the Hennepin History Museum. But every county has a historical society, and most of those organizations are funded in part by their county. So there's that traditional relationship. And then the other 60% is private funding, a mixture of individuals and members and corporate and foundation support as well. So we hustle for a lot of our budget.
I have two questions. And the first one is about Getty, because I visited that museum for the first time a couple years ago, and it was very impressive. And I see you went to school there. So I was just wondering, does Getty, how does Getty work with museums like yours? That would be one question. Shall I ask the other one right away too? or-
Sure.
Okay.
Sure.
So the other one is, as everybody in this room likely knows, Plymouth is full of what we call small groups. And they tend to be various sizes from maybe a dozen to a few dozen people. So I'm in one of those. So if we were to sign up, how long does that tour take and what hours of the day do you do it? And I'd just like to hear more about that because I
Sure.
think our small group would
The
like to
walking
go.
tour takes about 90 minutes, and we currently are going to be doing it about once a month. We
Ah.
haven't, we're testing the demand,
Uh-huh.
frankly. So over in St. Paul, the Summit Avenue walking tour is every Saturday morning like clockwork because they've built the demand. We may get to that point, but right now it'll be 3-4 times this summer for a 90-minute experience. But again, demand-based, and it's easy for us to schedule the tour guides if we know we've got, so if one of your small groups wanted to get together as few as 15 people, it would be well worth our while to connect with you and do that.
So would that be the minimum 15?
Yeah, that's roughly what
Okay.
we say to
Okay,
make it a good experience. And we don't want to go much over 25 because then it gets hard to hear and hard to keep people
Right.
together and what have you.
Yeah. Then-
Let me finish the Getty piece unless you want more on walking tours.
I just want to say that I took that tour.
Oh,
Oh.
great.
And it was wonderful. I did it with the American Association of University Women who are housed in the neighborhood. of
Yes.
Hale-Field Mansion.
Mhm.
And it was wonderful because they gave kind of the whole history of the mansions and the park and things that happened in their houses that were removed, and it's really well worth it. Yeah.
Yeah, great. Thank you. I'm glad you enjoyed it. So very briefly on the Getty doesn't have a lot of regular interaction with museums, especially small museums like ours. But several decades ago, they were working with, I think it was the American Association of Museums. It's a nationwide group of museum. It's a professional association. And they wanted to create a leadership institute for mid to later career museum professionals. And so it was a 3-week seminar that I went to so it was kind of a one and done in terms of the Getty. And the Getty served as host primarily. A lot of art museums were there, and then a smaller snippet of history museums. And so we had fun dealing with those cultural differences. But it was just a great program and a great thing that they offer to give those of us who'd been doing this work for a number of years a fresh way to think and draw upon our experience and then draw upon the professors for a few weeks to try to pull things together in an interesting way. So I would say the seeds that it planted for me, the focus the year I was there was all about values and what are your core values as an institution, and how do you talk about shared values, and how does that drive strategy? And that planted seeds in a big way for what I ended up doing here at Hennepin History Museum.
So Hennepin County is it's a very large county. And so my question is, how are you trying to serve kind of that size of the county? I'm thinking like the far western where it's more rural, suburban. And I think
It's
yeah.
an excellent question. With as long of an answer as you want, so I'll try to keep it short. Let me start by saying I forgot I was going to pass these out. Jackie, could you just let those pass around the room a little bit? One of the ways we do it in real time right now, there's a lot of aspirational to your question, but in real time, what we do is we have a magazine that's published 3 times a year, and the editor is very conscious and intentional about making sure that we've got stories from all over the county. And you can see as it goes around, she puts on the cover of every magazine little geodots to show where the stories are located, that issue. We've got a lot more to do in the museum itself, and we're trying to slowly but surely figure out ways to do that. One of the complicating factors that turns into the long form of the answer is the way Hennepin County developed, very different than a lot of counties around the state. Until the 1950s, 95-ish% of the population in Hennepin County lived in Minneapolis. And the rest was all rural. Of course, the mid-20th century suburban boom changed Hennepin County profoundly. As there were small towns all around Hennepin County, but I think the focus then of Hennepin Historical Society at that time was very Minneapolis, because that's where all the stories were, at least that's what they assumed. So unlike many of the counties around the state, almost every city of any size and significance in Hennepin County has their own historical society. And so I'm just, as COVID is loosening its grip a little bit, I'm trying to get out and meet with those folks and say, what are you up to? What are we up to? How can we help each other? How do we share telling these stories? And we'll look for opportunities to get some of those outer Hennepin stories into the museum. All of the exhibits I showed you today are a very South Minneapolis focus. And I'm eager to work. I had a chat with the president of the Richfield Historical Society a month or so ago. I'm eager to see if there's a research project about 35W construction in Richfield and Bloomington, because that's a different story, but I'm guessing it's an important story. His first thing was, yeah, but we should probably talk about all the highways, because 494 is a big deal in that part of town as well. So I'm eager to plant seeds along those lines. We know that racial covenants were not just in Minneapolis, Golden Valley, St. Louis Park, they're doing this Just Deeds project as well. And school desegregation is not a Minneapolis only thing too. So I'm hoping that the Hale-Field exhibit is just the first of further work on that. But there's a lot of ground to cover.
Yeah, thanks.
Is that on?
Is it? Oh, okay. I just wondered if your archives are accessible either online or in the library?
They are getting there. So you've just touched on a few of our key Achilles heels. No, that's good. Full disclosure. So our wonderful building over on 3rd Avenue, we've struggled for 40 years to think about how to improve that building, but we haven't gotten our act together. So that's kind of my task for the next decade, is to turn that around. So we do not have an ADA accessible building. That said, if you can manage some stairs, you can come into our library and do research in that building. More and more of the people doing research in our archives are doing it online via email. So they'll send a request to our archivist and she'll do the research or tell them, here's what we've got. Why don't you come in if that makes the most sense? We just got a legacy grant. It was awarded last week, where we're going to convert our currently barely better than DOS-based collections management software that's not online. We're converted over to a program called Collective Access, which historical societies around the state are using. So this time next year, you'll be able to go online and better search our collections because they will finally be online. But that's been another slow process.
Thanks.
Former board member, good to see you.
If I could interject a question, I was there recently and there was upstairs a wonderful small exhibit about Muslim families in Minneapolis. And
Yes.
I wonder if you could tell us a little more about the backstory of that, and if you work with current immigrant groups.
We don't work with them as much as we'd like. So that was an exhibit that was a traveling exhibit. It was developed by a group called Carry On Homes, working with the Iraqi American, forgetting the exact name of their group. but this had been traveling around. It was previous to us. It was down in Rochester at their art museum. So they had an opening and we had an opening. And so we pounced on that. And that created some interesting new dialogue with Iraqi Americans that we hadn't met before. But it was a great little art exhibit that showed, it was a person who made photo portraits of Iraqi Americans who have come here in the last 20 years and made Minnesota their home. And so just interesting reflections on what homeland means to them now, talking about their life in Iraq, talking about their life in Minnesota. So it was just a nice little piece to get a taste of it, I think.
Alex, do we have any questions online? Okay,
All right.
it gives me a chance to ask another one.
All right.
When was the museum actually chartered, and are you tied to that building for the long term?
We were chartered in 1938, and it was a project of the Works Projects Administration. So they had some funding here in Hennepin County, and there'd been a growing movement. Hey, we should have one of these historical organizations as well. We hopped around a couple places. We started out in St. Louis Park, and then we're at a building in Loring Park for a few years. And then in 1958, this building became available through a long but interesting story. And we've been here since 1958. So that's the short version. The long version is, at this point, we're planning to stay. The board just passed a resolution saying for the foreseeable future, we're going to make this building work. We're going to figure out how to work. We've got a lot of other priorities. We've got to build a better funding base, frankly. Whether we improve this building or move somewhere else, we're going to have to do some background work to build a better support system for ourselves. When they hired me, they hired a historic sites guy. So I'm inclined to say it's not because this building is old that it's got problems. It's a lot of deferred maintenance, and it's a lot of, we just need to think of it as an adaptive reuse kind of facility. It's not, in my opinion, it's not going to be a historic house where you take tours and learn about the Christian family, which is the original family. The drum I've been beating for 2 years is it's been a museum twice as long as it's been a home. So let's think about it as a museum. And if those 2 rooms upstairs are too small for an exhibit gallery because they were once bedrooms, we don't need to keep them as bedrooms. We could knock out a wall and create a bigger gallery, or we can add on an addition. So the board of directors hired a historic sites guy, and they hired somebody who spent 4 years at Mill City Museum, where that was like the ultimate adaptive reuse project. So it kind of cemented in my brain. We have to think imaginatively about these places, but I think there's a lot of potential there. And the other lesson I learned at Mill City Museum is neighbors are incredibly important, and walk-by traffic is important to health of a museum. So while we're overshadowed by MIA in many ways, MIA brings customers by our door every single day, or potential customers, and you can't trade that in very easily for a lot of stuff. So there's a lot of things to think through. A geographical center of the county might be attractive to the earlier question, but that's what we're going to spend the next few years continuing to think about.
Well, it is a wonderful location.
It is. And it's a beautiful building. Just, it needs a little TLC.
And I apologize if someone already asked about this or you talked about this, but I see people are holding the magazine. And I know, of course, that's a major cost to how you're running things. But I kind of think back to the mid 2000s, which is early 2000s, which when I was on the board. And some of those articles that were written are still things that I refer to or later became major efforts. Like there was a great article written about Hale-Field school pairing and things like that. So I'm curious, what do you think about the future of the magazine, and how are you sourcing writers and things like that? Yeah,
it's a great question. We haven't talked much about it yet. It's we're really we're really proud of the magazine as it's currently constituted. Linda Kautsky's our current editor, and she did a reboot of it 4 or 5 years ago, I think. So less of a focus on long academic articles and more of a focus on short, highly illustrated and a well-designed piece. And so it's gotten a lot of really positive feedback for us. It's won 2 honorable mentions from the American Alliance of Museums. So I haven't fretted too much about the cost because it's giving us a lot of value. It's giving us that geographical distribution. And we are a member-based organization, and it's by far and away the most attractive benefit for our members. Most of our members don't come to the museum, but they all read the magazine, and they tell us that they read the magazine. And so it's also the longest standing program of the organization, because we've been publishing that since I think 1941. So we've got no plans of slowing down on that. We do need to start to inject a little funding to diversify the author base. Right now, we live on the goodwill of people who volunteer their time to write the articles. And so we've had little snippets of money when necessary, when we can't get an author unless we pay them for their services. But we need to move in the next couple of years to just saying everybody deserves to be paid for their work. And so that's a direction we need to start to build towards. But we don't want to break something that seems like it's working pretty well as well. So yeah, are we out of time? Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, John.
Yeah.
As we leave, I just want to remind you to join us next Sunday when Bianca Dawkins, a survivor of domestic violence, will tell us of her experiences and her founding of ICON, a social enterprise whose mission is to raise awareness of and combat domestic violence. And I think it will be, again, well worth your time to join us, and I hope you will. Thank you.